What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It's Monday, February 24th. I hope you guys had a great weekend. We're going to jump back into playing catch up on some of the developments in the cases that we're covering. And today, we're going to read through the transcript of the redacted proceedings from that January 23rd hearing for Bryan Kohberger. This testimony revolves around the investigative genetic genealogy testing that was done. Now, the judge has ruled this DNA will stay in and also ruled the data from Apple, Google, Amazon, Bryan's apartment in Washington, as well as his parents' home in Pennsylvania will stay in. The judge said Kohberger's constitutional rights were not violated and law enforcement behaved properly. But we're going to read through this anyway because it gives a little insight into what happened when we couldn't watch. And the first witness was Detective Brett Payne, who is the lead detective on the case there in Idaho. He heard Kohberger's name first on December 19th, 2022. That was as a result of the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy. They had a phone call that evening, and that's the first time they were told Bryan Kohberger's name. Before that moment, he was not on their radar. Now, prior to hearing Bryan's name, he had reviewed a lot of video, including the neighbor at 1112 King Road, which was an exterior surveillance camera on a house immediately to the northeast of the crime scene. They also looked at footage from different streets and intersections, and they relied on these videos for vehicle identification. Some of the people he interviewed also included the victim's roommates. He said the decision to pursue the genetic genealogy was a collaborative decision amongst the command team to go that route, and he was part of that decision. But this was his first encounter with genetic genealogy. The reason they decided to take the work from the Othram lab to the FBI was because the Idaho State Police lab and Othram had exhausted their resources, and the FBI had more resources available to pursue this avenue, such as more databases where they could compare the sample to. He said their communications with the FBI were over the phone. After the sample was sent to the FBI, there were a few conversations which were mainly status updates, such as they were still in the process of testing, but would reach out if there was anything of interest they found. After the results, they only had Bryan Kohberger's name and nothing else. The FBI told them this was nothing more than a tip. So they began their own independent verification of whether or not Bryan was involved in the crime. On December 20th, the day after they got his name, they had a second meeting with the FBI who walked them through the family tree and how they came to his name. He said the conversation was in depth and way above his head, but essentially the FBI worked their way through a family tree and concluded Bryan was a possible source of the DNA on the knife sheath, and also a person they needed to look into again as just a tip. To the best of his knowledge, the FBI did not say this is Bryan Kohberger's DNA on the sheath. The day they got his name, which was the 19th, they started looking into him. And then on the 20th, they really started their basic investigative procedures, which included DMV searches, the NCIC offline returns, and that is the National Crime Information Center. It's a computerized index of missing persons and criminal information. And the purpose of that is rapid exchange of information between criminal justice agencies. They found Bryan had no criminal history. The witnesses asked about an unknown male B. It's unknown DNA from a blood spot on a handrail going between the first and second floor. They didn't pursue that because at that point they had Bryan's name, and entering another DNA profile into CODIS would remove the previous one they had from the knife sheath. If he remembers correctly, they decided to hold off and stay with the DNA from that knife sheath and could address that unknown male B at a later time. Another unknown male they designated as unknown male D came from a lab report which was taken from a sample of blood on gloves that were found outside the house. He wrote the affidavits to get the search warrants and started writing that long before Bryan was specified on the 23rd of December. He said maybe a couple of weeks before, And the affidavit started with a walkthrough of the crime scene and an interview of the roommates. Numerous things went into this affidavit, and he called it a living document, so he would essentially add information to it as the investigation progressed. After they knew Bryan's name, the witness added the traffic stop by Corporal Duke, and they were contacted by the Washington State University police who had ran his vehicle. And so the witness added that vehicle information about the white Elantra, as well as his residence. And also, he had registered on license plate reader cameras, and also his vehicle had been seen on cameras between Pullman and Pennsylvania. In the affidavit, the witness included the traffic stop from August as well as the one at Washington State University, but says the traffic stops were not on his radar before learning Bryan's name on December 19th. He put in information about front license plates being missing from Pennsylvania cars and says that the camera at the neighbor's house at 1112 King Road didn't show enough of the car to show there was no front license plate. But after he learned Bryan's name, that also became part of the affidavit. He's asked if he's aware that the living document was claimed by other people who did not give him credit, and he is. He also says he took a lot of language from experts, other officers, and agents. He and FBI agent Nicholas Balance worked on language that would satisfy what the prosecutor wanted to see for probable cause. He and Agent Balance also produced a map to show a possible route of travel for their suspect. The witness had interviewed the roommate with the initials DM 4 times at the time of the December 23rd report. And in the affidavit, he wrote the roommate heard Kaylee go upstairs and yell, "Someone's here," and then she ran back downstairs. He said it was a joint decision not to put the investigative genetic genealogy information in the probable cause affidavit in an effort to independently verify the information that was provided to them as a tip by the FBI in the same way they would any other tip. The goal was for them to validate Bryan's involvement or not. That was it for direct exam, and on cross, December 19th and the 20th, he's asked who the team was that was receiving the information from the FBI, and he names a lot of different agents. Essentially, they're all team leaders for the investigation, and this information wasn't any different than any other information sharing that occurred during the case. He said they had 2 briefings daily, typical in the morning and in the evening. And it wasn't just team leaders. It was everybody working on the case who was available to come and share information that they were finding. He's asked about the investigative genetic genealogy and if they received any medical information about Bryan, which they did not. On redirect, they go through the time frame for those daily meetings beginning on November 13th to December the 19th or the 20th, right after Bryan was identified, who was there. And the witnesses asked the first time they talked about Bryan in one of those meetings, it was December 19th, the day they got his name. And that was it for his testimony. The next witness was a forensic lab manager with the Idaho State Police Forensic Services. This located in Meridian, Idaho. It's just right outside of Boise. And that is the only DNA lab in the entire state. She's there to discuss forensic investigative genetic genealogy. She was the CODIS user, that's the National DNA Database, and she explains there are rules about what can be uploaded into that database. For example, they don't upload victims' DNA or the DNA of someone whose DNA would reasonably be in the crime scene, as well as DNA from a suspect whose DNA would reasonably be at a crime scene. That would be somebody who lives in the house or somebody who visited frequently. They'll create a DNA profile from these situations, but in order to run it through CODIS, it must be related to a crime and believed to be from the perpetrator of that crime. You can only use CODIS under certain circumstances. Unknown male A came from a swab of the knife sheath, which was submitted by the Moscow PD. The witness talks about the bidding process when they send out samples, and they move on to talking about taking the trash from Bryan's parents' house in Pennsylvania. They had a briefing before they took the trash, and she was asked what items are best to pull for DNA testing. Later on, she received evidence from the trash they took. That trash pull was on December 28th of 2022. The lab's job was to determine if DNA from the items could be inclusive of the DNA profile developed from that knife sheath, which was unknown male A. The witness didn't perform the test herself, but knows that one of the male profiles from an item in the trash could be from a biological parent or a child of the profile from the knife sheath. They referred to that person as male E, and they did a paternity comparison from a single source of DNA. The DNA on the sheath was from a single source. There were other areas on that knife sheath that were sampled as well. Her lab issued a report matching the DNA from the sheath to Kohberger, and a statistic was provided. She's asked if part of the knife sheath was preserved for fingerprints. She said that the swabbing for DNA is done first. That's their standard order of processing. The fingerprint division will let them know if they see any ridge detail and will tell them to try and avoid the area if they can. But at the end of the day, swabbing for DNA takes the priority. On cross, the state has her confirm they did not pull any medical information from Bryan's DNA, and she said they don't even do that in the lab she works at. She said the sheath also had blood on it, and they would have targeted that area separately and focused on an area where the suspect may have touched. She explains how when we touch something, we shed skin cells, which leaves touch DNA. On redirect, the witness said that they swabbed the entire leather portion of that strap, the top and bottom, and the underside of the button. They did not swab the top button because that's the most likely place a fingerprint would have been. The next witness, he is with the Idaho State Police Forensic Services. He talked about the contract they had with the lab to do some of this testing. The witness accompanied the investigator who had custody of the DNA sample from Boise to Houston, where the lab they hired was located. They told the lab what kind of analysis they were wanting, and his lab had to authorize for them to search family tree DNA as well as GED match. Both of those sites allow law enforcement to search their databases. The witness explains that a Y chromosome is passed from father to son, and they would be looking to identify a family line by tracking that Y chromosome DNA from father to son, or to grandfather, and potentially all the way down multiple generations. They would then tie them to a family line that they could investigate further. The lab in Houston got the DNA on November 22nd. They were notified to stop work on December 10th. Their recommendation to the Idaho lab was they had several individuals that had the potential to be of interest in the investigation. The lab in Houston asked them if they could be in contact with these individuals to see if they would be willing to contribute information into the database they were using in order to further the family tree building. In order to try and find these potential relatives, the witness said they did Google searches and looked at publicly accessible information. They found there were 4 brothers, but their last name wasn't Kohberger. An investigator with the Idaho State Police reached out to one of the brothers who had uploaded information into a database and asked if he would be willing to upload that into a database to help law enforcement further build out and use that information to come to their suspect. The man was skeptical about the contact, and they had a 3-way call to help validate this was indeed a law enforcement investigation and a legitimate request. The person asked to not be contacted again and was not interested in participating. The defense says the last name of one of the brothers was not Kohberger, but asks if the name Kohberger came up when they were building the family tree, and it did not. On December 10th, they had a big conference call, and they were asked to hand the investigative records over to the FBI, and they did. They call another witness from Intermountain Forensics. It's a lab that specializes in genetic genealogy. The testimony gets very technical about how they extract DNA from cells and the process after. I'm not getting into his testimony because I don't have a grip on it. The next witness was a genetic genealogist. He basically tells why he thought the FBI went into a database they shouldn't have. This gets a little confusing, but let's see if we can get it out to where you guys can understand it. Forgive me if you're confused by the end of this. He explains how the family tree was established. Othram's report showed two main DNA matches. They were low matches, but the lab found these two individuals were third cousins to each other. The individual who contributed to the crime scene descended from the second great-grandparent of those two matches. To try and simplify this, all right, you have a man and a woman who have children. The lab tracked down one of those children and then tracked down grandchildren and found there were four brothers. The lab recommended testing one of the four brothers to get more DNA to get a closer handle on where the crime scene profile might fit into that family. As we know, one of the brothers declined to participate. The witness says when he's working on a case, he gives his client the files so they have a record of all the work he did. And he expected the FBI to have that as well, but they did not turn that over. Othram finished their work on December 10th, and then the FBI took over. Again, the 10th is the day after Bryan Kohberger was identified. By December 19th, they had made their identification, and that was significant to the witness because the matches by Othram were low. Even if one of the four brothers had agreed to DNA testing, he said the testing itself would take some time to get the kit to the person putting their spit into the tube, sending that to the lab, and having it analyzed. He said it wouldn't have led to the crime scene profile because it was the wrong family branch. And the witness said going from low matches to an identification, or as the FBI called it, a tip, within 9 days, told the witness they had gone into a database they weren't supposed to be in. He said he was able to confirm his beliefs from an email where there's a screenshot from GED Match, which is a very open database, one of the top ones people load their DNA into, meaning any kit in the system is public and you can see people's matches. But if there's a forensic kit in the database, you can't see it. He saw a match list with someone who used the initials SC, and there is a match to the forensic profile from SC's perspective. That told him the forensic profile was uploaded through the regular GED Match portal because it should not have been visible to this SC person. And the email said, "This one is ours." He said GED Match tells you how many days a kit has been in their system, and the match to SC had been in the database for 1 day. But Othram had uploaded it 6 to 7 days prior, so it shouldn't have said the kit was only 1 day old. And based on that, his opinion was the FBI used a site that wasn't allowed. And he explains further, when they asked the FBI to turn over their match list, they said they couldn't because the list was over 20,000 people. And if they had used GED Match Pro or Family Tree DNA, the results would have been about 10,000. So his opinion is that they used a database they shouldn't have been in. Eventually, they listed the GED Match, but not GED Match Pro. Law enforcement is not supposed to go into GED Match. He said they also admitted they uploaded to MyHeritage. The witness talks about how you can take part of that DNA and pay a fee of $12 at a website and get a comprehensive medical information report, such as your likelihood of getting a certain disease. Now, it was testified to that they never did try to get any of Kohberger's medical information. After they were done with the witness, they just discussed some various topics. One of the biggest things that the judge said is the defense is not conceding that the DNA found on the knife sheath was Bryan's, and he has no position to object to the testing of the DNA and the knife sheath. So, a little bit confusing in some areas, but it gives you a little bit of insight into what happened when we weren't able to watch. But ultimately, the judge ruled the DNA stays in as well as the other things that the defense wanted to have suppressed. And we march forward towards trial. So that's it for today. I hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon, and we will see you soon.